Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is August 30th, 2018, and we're into episode 101. Politicos is the BC Politics podcast. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you found us. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticosPod, and join our many supporters at patreon.com/politicos.
I'm Stuart Boom.
I'm Ian Bushfield, and today we're joined by
Micah Goldberg. I'm back.
Thanks for coming out to the live show.
Oh, you're welcome.
And asking questions that we were totally not prepared for, but instead we're going to give you a chance to rant about them today.
That sounds good to me.
But we have a ton of other things to talk about. We're going to get you to help us break down this Federal Court of Appeal decision that was released this morning that might just kill the TransMountain pipeline. Maybe, maybe not. BC's decision to sue opioid manufacturers. Then we're going to follow up on the Conservative Party conference that happened this past weekend. We're going to touch on political deaths, and then we have a litany of quick takes, because apparently the end of August, the dog days of summer, are supposed to be like quiet, but it's just wild, and it's like a rabid dog day of summer.
Everyone's just trying to get their stuff in before school starts.
There we go. The other things we won't be talking about are the race to finish NAFTA talks, the fact we're having the worst wildfire season in history, or that the mayor of Victoria sort of made a non-apology for how she handled John A.'s statue.
But we will talk about the Sasquatch lawsuit, I have been assured.
Oh yeah, that's very important.
Only
stuff.
real news on this program.
We're probably going to end up cutting this show down for the main feed. You can find the full discussion of all this conversation at patreon.com/politicos. I haven't decided yet what we'll cut out. We'll see how it goes. First, as always, we'll thank our premier sponsors, Lindsay Teds, for helping make the show possible. And of course, check out our partner at BC Today. As we spoke with Shannon Waters last week, everyone knows she's brilliant. If you want to hear her objective takes that are less, let's say, critical of past premiers, you can check out BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated to BC politics. You get a free 2-week trial by going to britishcolumbiatoday.ca and entering the offer code CITIZEN, which gives you a special rate after that trial concludes. It's where we get all our content these days, or at least make sure that we're not missing anything. So it's definitely worth at least checking out for a couple weeks. Well, and I think the last thing to do before we jump into it is just thank everyone who came out to our 100th episode live show and helped us get to 100 episodes. Let's move on to the lawsuits that are happening. Micah, what are we doing with this class action lawsuit to sue pharma companies?
This is not the first time British Columbia has taken on a massive lobby. In around 2000, the province went after Big Tobacco. Counsel at the time included Andrew Wilkinson, who is counsel for some of the big tobacco companies, so he'll be familiar with this type of lawsuit. And those suits proved to be, at least from a legal standpoint, successful. British Columbia went to the Supreme Court of Canada. The Supreme Court of Canada affirmed their ability to sue Big Tobacco. Those suits are, in some ways, still proceeding through the legal chain, although my understanding is that some individual suits have been settled. So that's by way of background. This isn't the first time that British Columbia has engaged in a class action lawsuit against a party that has been seen to have negatively impacted the healthcare system. This time, what David Eby has proposed is a lawsuit, a class action lawsuit, against big pharma or opioid producers, people who are producing pain-killing drugs like Oxycontin. And there's about 40 defendants that have been named by the Attorney General. And the way that this class action is going to proceed is that there's going to be a representative plaintiff, and the action is going to be certified for all of the individuals who fall under the categories that are ascribed. Those are victims of the opioid crisis. And once the case is certified, you're going to start seeing some suits settle individually, some protracted litigation here and there. But the idea, of course, is to recoup some of the costs that have been lost by the British Columbia government as a result of the opioid crisis. So I think that's a general background of what's going on.
So what is the core complaint that the BC government's alleging here?
To the big pharma producers of opioids, you have fucked up the system by which we provide healthcare to our citizens. Yeah, I think that's all legalese and in the notice of civil claim.
So they've named all these pharma companies like Purdue Pharma and all the big typical names, but they've also named some pharmacists like Shoppers Drug Mart and I think a few of the others. So I guess the claim is this, idea that they knowingly pushed these prescriptions of these painkillers beyond what would be reasonable or necessary.
Precisely. It's not just the manufacturers, but as you're pointing out, Ian, it's the distributors as well, the retailers. And the idea behind it, just as in the tobacco cases, there's been misrepresentation here. Some of it perhaps innocent, but the thrust of British Columbia's lawsuit is going to be that it was knowing, perhaps fraudulent, and it resulted directly in death and injury, and that this all could have been foreseen.
So is there a reason they're not going after like the College of Pharmacists or the College of Physicians, the people who would have been prescribing it?
The idea is that those individuals may have been lulled in. So doctors have to get educated, right? And someone's got to tell them what the effects of the drugs are. And what the British Columbia government is at least appearing to say is that the manufacturers who educated the doctors misled them. And in the case of OxyContin, made some representations that the drug was not as addictive as it was, in fact, or at least as addictive as the effects seem to bear out.
What does BC hope to get out of this if they're successful?
The answer to all of your questions is money.
Is there a specific amount they're alleging?
No, and that amount, of course, is going to depend on the individual that's been affected by it, right? It's not just a huge lump sum payment that the British Columbia government's looking for. It's going to depend on the individual lawsuit. And in the case of tobacco, what the British Columbia government did, which I would argue is somewhat ingenious, is that they've contracted out individual lawsuit cases to big law firms in British Columbia, so that the big law firms absorb most of the cost. And yes, they'll get a lot of the money out of the litigation, but then they have to pay an amount back to the province. So the province isn't being flooded with litigation. Rather, they're sending out the work to specialized firms that can deal with personal injury claims of this nature. And everyone should get paid. You would hope that, the law firms take an appropriate amount, the province takes an appropriate amount, and of course, the victims who get lost in this high-level discussion also get something on account of their suffering.
One of the challenges for class action lawsuits is really trying to define a class, and I think courts tend to be hesitant to, certify class actions because people's damages can be very different or their experience with something. What do you see as the chance of success of the courts actually saying people who got addicted to these all sort of suffered similarly, and so we can treat all of these people the same?
I think that the chance, and courts surprise me all the time.
Sure.
I mean, we've hosted a segment called Micah Was Wrong on this podcast before. So, like I say, you've got to take a lot of this stuff with a grain of salt, especially my predictions. I would be very surprised if a class was not certified based mostly on the success of the tobacco lawsuits. If you could define a class in that lawsuit, which is highly analogous to this case, I would be surprised if the court would not allow a similar class in this big pharma lawsuit.
So you seem fairly positive about this, and you think there's a good chance of success, but kind of what's the flip side of that? Is there a way for big pharma to get around this lawsuit?
Absolutely, and you've identified some of those ways. Like, there's no litigation that's a slam dunk. The way that British Columbia curbed it in their last go at big tobacco was to create a statute that allowed them to do this. And that statute was appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada. I imagine similar steps are going to be taken here. So you might see some sort of unconstitutional basis on which a certification is appealed if it's grounded in statute. And as I think both of you pointed out, Ian and Scott, the certification battle is the ground zero of where this fight is going to be taken. And depending on how that definition is made out by the British Columbia government, that will give most of the opening to whoever is named as the defendants to attack the British Columbia government. Don't forget, 40 defendants, they're all going to be well heeled. So this isn't going to be a bunch of poor companies, mom and pop shops who can't afford a lawyer. You're going to see high-class lawyers defending Big Pharma. But the problem for Big Pharma, of course, is that there's a number of analogous lawsuits in which they've been unsuccessful, and American governments have taken them to task and have recouped some of their costs. So they have a losing record.
Well, we mentioned Alberta considering joining this lawsuit, but one place where Alberta and BC are on very different sides of the courtroom is in this TransMountain ongoing lawsuits. And Rachel Notley has liked to brag that she's been, batting 1,000, 17 lawsuits up, 17 lawsuits down. But the problem with that is like a single loss is devastating, where, you can do, it's all great until it's not. And today it wasn't for her, was it?
Today was not a good day for anyone that wanted to see the TransMountain pipeline built. Today was a great day if you are a big E environmentalist or massive L liberal, because today the TransMountain pipeline, it was announced that it will not be twinned because a number of First Nations were successful in appealing an order brought by the National Energy Board. So for this, I'm going to have to go to the glasses a little bit, because by admission, I'm not a Aboriginal lawyer. That is not my trade, but I have read through all 250 pages of this decision, some more carefully than others.
Sure.
So I'm going to give you a little bit of background. The National Energy Board is required to sign off on interprovincial pipelines in Canada and has to, among other things, show that the project is in the national interest. And what ended up happening after the National Energy Board signed off on this project is that a number of First Nations and municipalities, including City of Vancouver and Burnaby, opposed the TransMountain application on various grounds. Okay, so the summary for what the Federal Court of Appeal finds is at paragraph 6. So the Federal Court of Appeal concludes that Canada acted in good faith and selected an appropriate consultation framework. However, at the last stage of the consultation process, Canada failed to engage, dialogue meaningfully, and grapple with the real concerns of the Indigenous applicants so as to explore possible accommodation of those concerns. The duty to consult, the court concludes, was not adequately discharged.
So over the multi-year consultation process, they did it mostly right, stumbled at the 5-yard line, and now we are here.
That's the general idea. So if I can synthesize one of the two issues that the Federal Court of Appeal focused on, which was the failure to adequately discharge the duty to consult, it seems that, or at least the Federal Court of Appeal found that the feds listened. They talked to 130, or tried to talk to 130 different groups. And although they listened, they didn't really do anything about it. So what the courts have now set up are I'll call them the extremes in the duty to consult. So you don't have a veto if you're a First Nation. You can't say, there's this pipeline going through, I don't want it built, period, the end. But on the other hand, you can't just show up and record what people are saying like a secretary or a transcriber and then do nothing about it. Mm-hmm. You have to show up in good faith and actually be prepared to talk and discuss and dialogue and maybe fight over different things. So the courts are looking for something in the middle. And what they found in this case was that the feds didn't do that.
And a lot of this on the last yard line or whatever issue relates around the bands here around Metro Vancouver, the ones who are concerned not necessarily with the pipeline route itself, but the effects it would have offshore. So one of the big concerns people talk about with this pipeline is the facility in Burnaby will be expanded, so more tankers will come in and out, and we don't have a clear understanding of what will happen if there's a bitumen spill into the Burrard Inlet. We're not necessarily fully aware of what will happen to the orca populations or fish populations if there are more big noisy boats going up and down the inlet. And it was those concerns that it sounds like the government just went, yeah, okay, you have those, but whatever. Sort of.
So there, as I mentioned before, there's two concerns that the Federal Court of Appeal focused on. The duty to consult is a lot more nebulous. It's a bigger obligation. But the issue with project-related marine shipping, which it sounds like you're focusing on, Ian, that's a sort of separate process, and it goes to more of the procedural fairness element of what the National Energy Board or the feds were actually doing when they were consulting. What the feds did is they excluded project-related marine shipping from the overall project. So they said, okay, we don't really need to analyze this, or we don't need to analyze it the same way. And the court was like, well, that's not really fair. You can't just exclude something that's obviously going to be tangential or an issue. And as you've pointed out, Ian, one of the biggest issues that the Tsleil-Waututh Nation focused in on and hammered home was the welfare of the southern resident killer whale population and what its effects will be, corresponding to an increase in the marine vessel traffic associated with the project. So it seems like the feds skipped over that inconvenient truth, and the court said that's not right. That is not procedurally fair to sort of skip over this issue and address how you're going to deal with it.
Well, before we go from this lawsuit to what comes next, is there any other gems or like highlights you took from reading this decision that you think are worth sort of pausing on?
Just one, and although I'm not an Aboriginal lawyer, I don't practice in that area of the law, I think it is reassuring to a number of individuals who do that just as the First Nations cannot halt a project unilaterally, the duty to consult isn't just one way, right? There is some give and take, some meaningful dialogue that has to happen, and I am buoyed in large part by the court's insistence that the feds can't just show up, listen, and move on. There has to be not necessarily give and take, but some meaningful dialogue that takes place. And we are working towards reconciliation, and that's something that I think every citizen of this country has to take a part of. And looking at how the duty to consult is progressing and how it's being analyzed, this is a decision that at least supports the idea that First Nations have a role to play in determining what happens on their territories and determining what happens in the country as a whole. But this is a case that seems obviously destined to the Supreme Court of Canada to get there anyways. And I am very interested to see how Wagner deals with this issue. This will be, to my understanding anyways, his first duty to consult case that he'll be taking leadership over. I'm interested to see who's going to write that decision. I'm interested to see whether it's going to be unanimous, whether there's going to be multiple decisions, more than one minority maybe, or a concurring decision in part. So there's a lot of exciting elements if you're coming at this from somebody who is interested in the Supreme Court of Canada's jurisprudence and the direction they'll be taking.
So that seems like a good spot to pivot over to what happens next. And you already alluded to that there's a very high probability that the federal government will appeal this.
If you're just looking at economies of scale, and I'm going to keep on going with the baseball analogies here, there is an opportunity for the government of Canada to hit a walk-off home run and to just have this project go through. They go to the Supreme Court of Canada and they win, it's over, right? They can build the project and there's nowhere left to appeal if you're the First Nations groups or if you're the municipalities that supported this lawsuit. So it just makes sense to go there. Now, could be tied up. There are some bases on which to have a expedited appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. I highly doubt that the First Nations are going to want to be advocates for that sort of expedited procedure, but it is possible, at least hypothetically, that Canada will be able to roll this through. And in terms of timing, I'll tell you for sure, I'm not entirely sure how long it will take to get there, but that 2019 election date is getting real close. And this is not the sort of luggage that Trudeau wants to take with him into the next election.
Yeah, that's the kind of other path is, or in addition to fighting this at the Supreme Court, is go back and redo these two things. Because all this judgment did was basically just void the, it was an order in council, I think, just voided that. Said, get better NEB reports back, you can go ahead and redo it effectively. So do you think they're going to just go ahead and try and get those better, higher quality NEB?
Here's the fundamental issue. Let's say you're Trudeau, let's say that you don't want to go up to the Supreme Court of Canada, okay? Or you lose at the Supreme Court of Canada and you need to consult. You cannot consult with another party that potentially wants to slow down the process. You've already been smacked by the Federal Court of Appeal that you haven't done enough give and take. So it's not like there's a box to tick that you can just do X, Y, and Z and you've completed your duty to consult. That duty, as we've discussed, is extremely nebulous and it requires good faith and it requires time. So in terms of trying to figure out what the timeline is in order to exercise the duty to consult and exhaust it, I can't tell you how long that's going to take. If any Aboriginal lawyer told you with a precise timeline how long that was going to take, you should stop listening to them. Because what needs to happen is all the parties need to sit down, all of the issues need to be raised, and there needs to be a good faith negotiation. So I can't tell you in terms of months. It depends on what the two parties do. But like I say, there is a clear date that the feds will want to do this. And I wouldn't be surprised, actually, if the feds were unsuccessful at the Supreme Court of Canada, or maybe they tried to do both. They tried to appeal and also do negotiations afresh. And they just tried to ram this thing through just like they did last time, maybe with a little bit more nuance in their strategy.
A nuanced ramming.
Yeah, nuanced ramming. And then just tried to get everything done before the election happened so that, they wouldn't have to carry this baggage forward, even if the First Nations do bring forward another lawsuit, which, by the way, they can do that, right? If the negotiations don't go the way the First Nations want the negotiations to go, or the results that they're seeking, they can just do the exact same thing that they did before and rely on the previous case as precedent.
We've talked a couple times about 2019 and the election. The Conservatives, I guess, have the same position, though. Like, they want the pipeline built more, in their words, but do they have any more levers than Trudeau to build this thing?
Not really. Their whole line of attack is Trudeau's doing the thing we want badly.
Well, the other political angle to come out is right next door to us in Alberta, where Rachel Notley this evening took to a press conference to just, lose it and just complain that this is selling out Canada to Donald Trump.
Basically took a ball and went home.
She started yelling at basically everyone else. She said Trudeau needs to immediately appeal this, do whatever it takes to push this through, recall Parliament for an emergency session to, I don't know what Parliament can do at this point. They can't really pass a law to override Indigenous concerns.
I really hope the subtext wasn't the notwithstanding clause there.
But most notably, she pulled Alberta, who was one of the first provinces after BC had its climate tax for a number of years. And Alberta became one of the first provinces in the last couple of years to put a new carbon tax in place. And now she's going, well, Trudeau made this deal that we'd get a pipeline, and if we put his carbon tax in, and now we're not doing our carbon tax anymore. Which I get, like, she's mad and she's staking her election on not losing the pro-pipeline majority of Alberta, who might be somewhat sympathetic to the NDP. But at this point, who's her base?
Well, you know how they say all politics is local, and the Alberta NDP probably know that better than most. And the fact is, you are just not going to do well politically in Alberta if you appear to be anti-oil sands or anti-pipeline. It's like if you're the Premier of Ontario and you're anti-manufacturing. Like, it's the core industry, and it's just very difficult to stake out an anti-oil position if you're ever want to be taken seriously in Alberta politics. And that does put the NDP in a bit of a tough position. And you could argue that, okay, maybe they should have done more to transition the Alberta economy, but that's a lot tougher than a soundbite makes it sound. And she's in a bit of a rock and a hard place on this one. And her path to victory isn't going to be, I am the best for oil, because she will never beat Jason Kenney on it. But there's a path to defeat that goes through, I didn't stand up enough for Alberta industry.
And there's potentially also a path to not having your base turn out, which involves, I've given up on climate change.
Yeah, and that's why today's reaction is pretty tricky on that. And I can kind of see it from a provincial, federal, federalism politics side. But from the, how do I get reelected? Yeah, it gets a little fuzzier there. And we were talking before the podcast about whether or not she is completely unelectable, and it's going to be a tough battle. The odds are really stacked against her, but there is a path forward, mostly involving Jason Kenney's UCP having a couple bozo eruptions,
which undoubtedly will happen. We're talking about Alberta. There's this guy from Alberta who thinks Sasquatch exists. We've talked about him. We've talked about him once before, I believe, maybe twice. The guy's suing to prove Bigfoot exists. Tell us why.
I literally read a 250-page decision in an area I do not practice in, so I can talk about this lawsuit. There is a guy in Alberta who is maybe the greatest litigant I've ever heard of, and he is claiming for the very rational and understandable number of $5 million. Because the truth is out there, Ian. And the truth is that a Sasquatch exists and that the man has suppressed any information related to the Sasquatch. So he apparently set out to prove that the Sasquatch couldn't exist and then was overwhelmingly convinced of the opposite. And I'll just note, by the way, that he makes his money running a week-long Sasquatch-seeking expedition, charging $5,000. So this might be just a free advertisement for this guy, which I have no shame in participating in, because stories like these are why I went to law school.
So break it down a little again, because how do you sue to prove something exists? Like, what is his actual damage? Does he just say, like, his week-long trips suck because he never finds Sasquatch? Or like,
so
or
I'm
because
hoping,
the government is lying about it?
I'm hoping he can explain that to me, because I feel like there's a lesson here for me. I don't know how he's come up with that amount of damages. I don't know on what basis there is to seek a $5 million award. But
Did he hold his pinky up to his side of his mouth when he said $5 million?
No, not that I know of. Instead, he went to New West last week to demonstrate to Justice Ball that he had, and I'm quoting, way beyond a reasonable doubt of evidence, based on cases, by the way, that I have personally been involved in. I don't think I've ever had way beyond a reasonable doubt type of evidence. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure the moon landing has way beyond a reasonable doubt amount of evidence. So we'll see what happens. My favorite part of this story, though, is that Justice Ball reserved reasons. And usually when it's like there's an overwhelming victor, the justice will just, take the lunch break and come back and provide their reasons from the bench. They won't, leave for the day and type up their reasons. Yeah. And that sometimes takes days or weeks, sometimes months. So obviously Justice Ball is going to give this one some thought. But I'm happy to come back and break down what is likely to be a very miserable day for Sasquatch believers everywhere, because I'm not sure how, unless this guy did have way beyond a reasonable doubt, I'm not sure how he's going to escape the error of reality test. That's the test to dismiss a lawsuit if there's just no error of reality. And I don't know how this guy is going to do that. I mean, is there an error of reality in this room about what he's claiming for? Do either of you even think it's remotely possible that he could walk out the door with $5 million?
So
no.
Is his claim... So
Ian's avoiding the question.
No, well, I'm saying, is his claim that Bigfoot exists or that he has evidence the government has suppressed it?
Both.
Or both? Because either of those are difficult, because neither is true. But, if he can prove Bigfoot seems like the easier one, but then to somehow prove... does he have disclosure from the Attorney General's office and others?
So I have
and
no
Ministry
idea.
of Forests?
I have no idea what he has, and frankly, I feel like this would have been a great case to be pro bono counsel, and I'm kind of sad I didn't have that opportunity.
Hey, if he listens, you're available still, right? So
yeah,
for his appeal.
Yeah. We can draft up a retainer agreement, I guess.
Before we move on, I get that everyone gets their fair hearing and everything, but is there not just the judge just laughs out loud and tells you to go away?
So that does happen in some cases, but that's usually followed by an oral decision, right? By oral reasons from the bench. Like I say, the judge goes away for an hour or so and comes back. Or in some cases, they don't even go away. They just sit there and look at the evidence and in 2 or 3 sentences say, no, this case can't go forward. But in this case, obviously, Justice Ball heard enough to think to himself, I'm going to give a thorough amount of evidence. My theory is that there was so much media in the room, there were so many people around. He wants to make it clear what the laws are, what's going on here. This is one of the very few cases where people who are not interested in the law, people who will have skipped through my first 2 discussions and diatribes on the law, will actually read a decision and read a case. And I think what Justice Ball wants to do is show that justice is actually being done.
Moving on from Sasquatch to something that's only a little bit less ridiculous. Milking the convention. The Conservative Party had their convention, and we talked about this a couple weeks back leading into it, and, happened last weekend. People went to Halifax, argued about a bunch of stuff, got in a little controversy about the dairy industry, and, here we are to tell you all what happened.
So they only adopted half of what I think Laurent described on The Boys in Short Pants as the Jordan Peterson is our new mullah platform, maybe. They decided not to fully repeal their position on abortion, but they are in favor of restricting it on foreign aid and, some of the sort of edge cases. But despite Campaign Life Coalition, who'd gone fully in to this convention to really push forward, and that's why highly ranked policy debates included, let's repeal the Conservatives' pledge never to legislate on abortion and legislate on abortion. So that's didn't win narrowly, but their approach, which was Harper's approach of, well, abortion fine, we won't talk about in Canada, but when we're doing foreign aid, let's make sure we're not funding abortion because we're a social conservative party, of course. Well, they were a bit conflicted on abortion. They controversially did decide that a Canadian is not always a Canadian.
Yeah, and this is the thing that spurred the most controversy out of the whole thing, is they voted to adopt that no birthright citizenship thing we talked about in episode 99, which is
wild.
It's downright radical, you could say, in terms of a response to the perceived birth tourism problem that, they've been unable to actually quantify.
Let's just be clear. The nativist Trump Republican Party does not have this as a policy.
Yeah,
they are still fine with people who are born in the US are American. The Conservative Party of Canada is now further right on this issue, or further nativist and nationalistic whatever, than Trump.
About a month ago, some conservative commentator floated the idea in the Washington Post, and everyone was like, no, this is a bad idea. We don't want to do this. It fundamentally changes what it means to be American. And that was the early trial balloon among American conservatives, and that did not go anywhere. So it's, a little surprising to see it happen here.
And it didn't sail through. It was a 55-45 type vote, like a narrower win, whereas a lot of these policies probably got almost unanimous support. I can't imagine anyone there was against the ABCs of competition, or some of the other just free the beer, for example, came up. We've talked about that with you in the past, Micah.
One thing that, has come up a bit in the responses to the outcry over this, and, the Liberals sent out a fundraising email the minute the ink was dry on that resolution, was to point out that, other countries do it that way, but they're all of the old world countries where you basically everything in the Western Hemisphere works on the birthright citizenship model, which makes a lot of sense for countries full of immigrants.
I think there was one thing that pointed out that Australia did away with it in the late 90s, and New Zealand then followed a decade or two later. They do follow their own kind of politics down under, but
it's don't actually have a great way to describe it, but it really does seem to kind of go to the core of what it means to be Canadian.
Other things were decided at this convention, of course. I don't know how contentious these were. The ABCs of competition that we mentioned prior, I'm sure that's sailed through. But they did approve the Canadian embassy in Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's the other really controversial thing I pulled out of here was, that also seems to be one of those signs the Conservative parties kind of drifting rightwards in a lot of way, because before now, everyone's kind of been under the consensus that this would be a very bad idea that would really inflame things in the Middle East, and it probably wasn't worth doing.
Maybe taking that as Canada's position would get us in good with Trump, which I don't know would help us solve NAFTA or something. I don't know. Maybe there's a logic there. I don't agree with it, but
by the time the Conservatives in power, that NAFTA thing's going to be sorted out, because it won't be in 2019 at this rate.
The reassuring thing is that few policies adopted at a convention these days make it into a platform. It's really just what the leader and their strategists decide will win that becomes the platform. I mean, that's not an encouraging sign for grassroots democracy, but it is a political reality.
It's one of those things that's best left unsaid, which got them into a little bit of hot water when it turns out that was said. So the other big controversy wasn't around necessarily only the motions they passed, but some of the lobbying around one of the motions they didn't end up passing, which was the supply management one, which we'd mentioned when we did the overview of what was going to the convention a couple weeks back. And this was the Conservatives should stop supporting supply management, which would actually be the Conservative position, but they're not letting that get in their way.
Turned out the dairy farmers showed up and were very active.
Yes, and in fact, they're left the binder full of their lobbying plans laying around the convention, which...
You sure that wasn't Mad Max, like, had, like, a copy and he was just skulking around and then, like...
I don't think he's that subtle.
No. But he would leave something sensitive laying in public sight.
Yeah, no, that is very on brand for him. So, among the things in there was that they felt confident that even if they couldn't defeat this motion, that it wouldn't really matter because Andrew Scheer assured them that no matter what the Conservative Party said, it wasn't going to be in the platform.
The merits of the supply management debate aside, the politics of this are just hilarious to watch because the Conservatives should obviously be against it if they're at all ideologically consistent. The Liberals and NDP can have nuanced reasons for supporting or not supporting it, but the party of the free market supporting basically a Stalinist style centralized
Well, you'll notice
system.
that ABCs of competition missing the D for dairy.
Yeah, it was such an obvious... Yeah, they could have just tacked it on there, the ABCDs of competition. They should have done it.
It would have gone, though, from like the first 3 policies in its section, though, to the bottom, the way the party manipulates the voting. But just everything about this, and the lobbyists being so blatant in it, like the wealth that the restricted supply has created within supply management has meant the dairy farmers of Canada have an insane amount of money to spend on lobbying, and for them to be so blatant about it and to have just like a briefing book.
If they didn't have them in paper format, they wouldn't be able to provide pre-written letters for supportive Conservatives. So, yeah, not only did they have a very strong lobbying effort towards the leader, they were also astroturfing the shit out of the base.
What does Bernier call them? Fake conservatives?
Fake Conservatives.
Fake conservatives.
And, like reading some of the stuff here, and Tristan Hopper had a good piece in the National Post going through all of these details, which we'll link in the show notes. But, like, if you look at it, it's pretty easy to look at that, the actual outcome where it got completely buried, and kind of see that Matt's had a point when he called the Conservatives intellectually bankrupt. Or intellectually corrupt?
One of those.
Well,
corrupt.
Yeah, corrupt.
I think on my other podcast, we were talking about campaign finance reforms and how corporations and unions can't donate to municipal political parties. And I think it was Matthew Naylor who was saying on Canby Report, big money's never out of politics. And this is kind of the proof of that. Like, the dairy farmers can't donate to the Conservative Party of Canada. They can't donate to any of the other parties. Unions, etc. can't. And there are only so many farmers who actually could donate. So it's not a financial thing, but there's clearly a lot of other influences that they're pulling.
This is what, 11,000 dairy farmers? And the federal cap is what?
1,500 or something?
1,500 or something? Like, you work that out, that isn't a huge amount of money, all things considered. And, yeah, no, it's actually fascinating. And if someone hasn't done, like, a major study on this, it would be any of our poli-sci listeners to, get on this, is like just how influential the dairy industry is and how it's worked its way into the political system so much. It's just bizarre and a little crazy.
Beyond that, the Conservative Party convention seemed to go off pretty well. The one person who is really popular is Peter MacKay. He apparently gave the big barn burner opening speech.
Yeah,
so maybe he'll be the one to bridge the gap between Maxime Bernier and Andrew Scheer, just as he did for PCs. He was the PC leader at the time,
yes.
Right? Yeah. So between the PCs
who
and Steve
became leader on a I Will Never Merge platform.
Good times.
When Andrew Scheer inevitably loses after this next election, it wouldn't surprise me to see Peter MacKay throw his hat in the ring for another leadership bid.
Stranger things have happened in Canadian politics. Well, for a final quick segment, I know you wanted to talk, Scott, a little bit about death in politics and how we talk about political figures after they died, because this past week, Republican politician John McCain and former presidential candidate passed away following his fight with brain cancer.
Yeah, and specifically, I kind of want to touch a bit on the kind of way everyone talked about this rather than John McCain himself, who, I guess had his share of controversies and wasn't universally beloved. Though there was definitely a fairly strong outpouring in the wake of it, and kind of the reaction to that was very interesting to see, both who highlighted as, positive aspects, talked about how, reached across the aisle and all of that, versus the people who really kind of got so partisan so political that often a little kind of nasty and overly celebratory of someone passing.
Well, the meme joke that I saw going around Facebook and Twitter was a picture of Tarkin from Star Wars, the guy who was on the Death Star and who was in Rogue One, complaining about the guy who orders Alderaan get blown up. They were he was a war hero.
We did we did a 3-hour conversation about Star Wars on this pod. I don't think we need to explain who Tarkin is.
The memes were basically saying he did some bad things, but he was a war hero, and we should remember him fondly for that. And there's a part of me that really sympathizes with that line, because fuck John McCain's terrible politics. But I was listening to the discussion on Pod Save America where it's the guys who were in the Obama office when they were fighting the election against John McCain. And they said, we have a ton of respect for this guy, because when he could have gone low so many times, he didn't. There would be hecklers in front of him complaining that Obama's an Arab and so they shouldn't vote for him. And he's like, he's not. Stop talking like that. Now, obviously, the better answer is it doesn't matter. But this was also 8 years ago, so...
America wasn't in the place where anybody was saying that as a response, basically.
Yeah. At the same time, he also picked Sarah Palin as a running mate. Not a great decision, which he seems to possibly have regretted in hindsight. But, on things like the healthcare ACA repeal debate, where he finally came up and did the thumbs down to the skinny repeal and saved healthcare in America. Well, saved mediocre, compromised shit healthcare in America, which is better than not having it. He's a complicated figure.
Yeah, and he definitely was complicated, and a kind of universal admiration, maybe isn't the entirely appropriate response, but neither was kind of the, I think, far too reactionary, yay, he's gone, that some people had, or the bad pushback that some of politicians on the left got when they said nice things about John McCain. I know Jagmeet Singh and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez both, had some positive things to say in John McCain's memory, and they got a lot of pushback from their base on both of those. And while we obviously don't want to completely ignore the more problematic aspects of John McCain's legacy, at the same time, I think this kind of goes to one of those core issues about, how we function as a democracy and how the US functions as a democracy, where being able to respect people across the aisle enough that, you're not celebrating their death. When you're getting to the point where people are actually happy about this and are willing to publicly express that, it reveals, I think, kind of the fact that the culture is in a bad place on this, and that the real benefit of democracy isn't necessarily the outcomes, it's how we resolve our political differences. And if our political differences are this pronounced and people are willing to be this disrespectful on something like that, probably not a great sign. At least, I don't think this got quite as distasteful as some of the reactions when Margaret Thatcher passed.
Well, she was pure evil.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at. And people who were outright celebrating her passing. And this was someone who'd been out of politics for decades. And okay, even if you thought John McCain only contributed bad stuff to the American political life, you could at least make the argument that he was no longer making those decisions anymore. And that would be no way in my position, but I could at least see why people would think through that and get there. Whereas Margaret Thatcher, she hasn't been politically relevant and be able to influence things since 92? I think it just gets to a point where it's more just spiteful celebration at someone's death was no longer really affecting things. And I think that, if anything, revealed kind of the nastiness a lot more.
Let's move into quick takes. The first thing, which we only put in at the last minute, but it's actually one of the bigger stories that probably got the least coverage this week in BC, is that, and it's tough because none of us are accountants and this is also really boring, but the public accounts came out. And this is a really important step of our legislature because this is when all of the departments say how much money is coming in and out. And the good news for the BC NDP is their surplus is $301 million, $55 million more than was forecast in the budget in the spring, which is just like good news because they've been spending a ton. They've had to cover ICBC's big debts. They've spent a ton on forest fires, both last year and they're spending a ton this year. They're expanding a number of big programs like transit and childcare, but there's still money in the bank in a way. I mean, the debt increased, but also revenue increased. But one of the interesting sort of side notes that came out very quickly after is the Auditor General came out with a quick report saying, actually, the province should be using better accounting methods to deal with how it's essentially using all of these public utility and crown corporations' debts and revenues. And if you did it better, it turns out the surplus would actually be about 4 times as big, like $1.1 billion.
Yeah, it's weird when governments underplay their surpluses. Usually they want to brag about what a good job they're doing handling the public's money.
This is such a subtle accounting thing that I don't think any of us are qualified enough to really understand. Apparently the AG is working on a report to make it simplistic and digestible. But I think what the government has done, and this is actually, as far as I understand, something that NDP criticized the Liberals a ton for, is deferring revenues of 1 year across like the lifespan of a project or something. And the same with expenses. So rather than have these big spikes in 1 year, you've kind of just like smoothed everything out. But the problem is then, so if we put these all in this year, we'd have a big surplus this year. But by smoothing it out, they potentially guaranteed themselves small surpluses over a large number of years instead of a big surplus and then a bunch of deficits. Well, the other story I put in here is that as we move forward to cannabis legalization in a month and a half's time on October 17th, the federal government has been looking for a roadside test to use to tell when people are driving under the influence. And a lot of people, and we've had Kyla Lee on the podcast in the past to talk about some of the issues with this, but I think a lot of people think, well, if you're stoned, it's just like being drunk. And so you can just blow a little thing and it goes, ding, you're drunk and you're therefore intoxicated. Turns out THC in the blood, even though it's in the law that if you're above a certain level, you're too impaired to drive, doesn't correlate as strongly with actual intoxication. Nevertheless, the federal government has found the Draeger Drug Test 5000, cool name, that they are going to approve. And already Kyla Lee and her partner Paul Doroshenko have announced that they are going to, as soon as they can, start suing the crap out of this because the thing has a limited operating range. It's 4 to 40 degrees Celsius, which is actually pretty good, I think, for Metro Vancouver. But you get into the interior or anywhere else in Canada, and it doesn't work. So we sort of talked about this prior to the podcast with you, Micah, and you were saying you expect a lot of lawsuits.
Yeah, it's going to be hard for the police or the RCMP to rely on these readings when cannabis doesn't affect everyone the same way. And you can't use a reading like blood alcohol concentration in the same way when somebody uses cannabis. The difficulty here is going to be if the RCMP does rely, or the police do rely, on one of these Draeger 5000 results to put somebody, or to incarcerate somebody or to arrest somebody, and it goes before a judge, and the results of that test are in dispute for a number of reasons, including the reasons that Kyla has brought up. You're going to see a lot of people who might actually be stoned get out of sticky situations just because you're relying on a test that, far from being foolproof, introduces some element of a reasonable doubt here.
The one question I've seen raised about this DUI question, and you may or may not have a good answer for this, but there are a number of people who have cannabis prescriptions, medicinal ones, and not just the like, I have a headache sometimes and I just want weed, but the like, this actually helps treat my chronic pain or whatever. how do you think the law sort of affects them? Are they potentially at risk of getting these DUIs?
Well, the law doesn't necessarily change at all, right? Because those people are already able to drive with special prescriptions or with special restrictions or with prescribed means to do that. The law only affects recreational users. So I'm not clear on, or I don't believe that the legalization of cannabis is going to affect anybody who is prescribed the drug.
Well, moving on is the mandate letters are now out for the most recent cabinet shuffle. And, I mean, it's mostly what you'd expect. But one item in particular caught a lot of people's attention. And that was the item in Bill Blair, the new Minister for Border Security and Organized Crime Reduction, who has been asked to lead an examination of a full ban on handguns and assault weapons in Canada, while not impeding the lawful use of firearms by Canadians.
There are increasing calls following some of the gun violence in Toronto, this sort of ongoing gun violence in Surrey, for a handgun ban. And a lot of people are talking about it with respect to cities, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Micah, are there any laws in Canada that apply to when you're within a municipality, like an urban one, but like a federal law, but then as soon as you leave a city limits, you're fine?
Like a criminal code provision that only applies in urban areas?
What you're describing is not federal jurisdiction, it sounds to me.
So this idea of like a municipal handgun ban never really made sense to me, but a debate over a national one, which...
They're already so restricted.
They are
They might as... For all intents and purposes, their legal use outside of very narrow circumstances is already banned. And then it gets to the point of, okay, if the only place you're legally allowed to have it is at home, in a lot safe, or at a range, functionally, is it much different than a complete ban?
I guess maybe the distinction is by allowing it in certain circumstances, people can justify bringing it into the country. If you completely ban it, we can just start getting rid of them entirely. And then anyone who's caught with one, you can clearly say you are not allowed that at all, period. So we have you on at least that. Even though they can kind of get them on that if you don't have the permit or something.
Yeah, if you're caught with a handgun, you don't have the authorization to transport, you're in pretty serious trouble.
I suppose you would also prohibit any licensed dealer from selling them in cities. I'm not sure how big of an issue that actually is. It would occur to me that the licensed dealers would be the most restrictive in terms of getting these guns out, but at least you can be assured that no guns are by legal means coming into your city. I mean, the debate does seem a little bit flawed for reasons you've pointed out, Scott, but also because the people who are selling guns legally have the highest vested interest in making sure that those guns do not find their way into the wrong person's hands.
Yeah, and we've talked before on the podcast about all the rules around possession, acquisition of firearms, and they're rather broad and strict. But it's just worth pointing out here that, handgun bans have been a staple of Toronto politics for decades now, I think, or at least 10 years. This specific mandate letter doesn't mention within the context of cities. It would be a nationwide ban.
I think that's because the federal government recognizes to some extent what their powers are, thankfully. We do need to probably have a bigger discussion about gun policy, and someone called us out for having half-assed ones, and that's probably largely on me. But we'll look into some expert to do a further discussion. I didn't look at the mandate letters because of time, but I do know one province where there are no mandate letters is over in Ontario, where Doug Ford appointed a cabinet, and then people went, "Oh, are you releasing mandate letters?" And he was like, "Why would I do that?"
In Doug Ford's defense, which is something I don't say very often.
Or ever. Yeah. Before today.
Tonight might have been the first time. The tradition of releasing mandate letters is actually fairly new. This isn't something that dates back to 1700s Westminster. I think it's only within the last few ministries at the federal level that this has even been a thing. So the Ontario government actually only started releasing their mandate letters in 2014. So this is a 4-year tradition that Doug Ford is throwing away.
It is a good thing in my view, but like you're saying, most ministers, we don't know what they were told to do, so it's not surprising Doug Ford would just not do it. Also because he's Doug Ford and he didn't have a platform. He probably doesn't even have mandate letters. He's just like, you're in charge of health. Go
Healthify the province.
Health the province. And so forth.
Who's the Buckabeer minister?
He may have taken that on personally. My time in Alberta, one thing I was doing there when I was an undergrad is I got involved in one of my first political campaigns, and that was Linda Duncan's attempt to unseat Raheem Jaffer. She ran against him in the riding of Edmonton Strathcona that includes the University of Alberta, and election night 2008, she wins, defeating him by like 500 votes or something. And hilariously, earlier in that evening, he'd actually declared victory because all the networks had called it for him, because all the polls that came in were the suburban ones, and it was the university ones that came in last, which we could see because I was in her office. And I'm bringing all this up because Linda Duncan announced this week that she's not seeking re-election in 2019. Sole NDP member of parliament in Alberta. We talked a lot today about the Alberta NDP's ire over the pipeline. Jagmeet Singh, as we mentioned, is in favor of this pipeline dying. So she was always in this very awkward position of being asked, so are you on Team Notley or Team Singh? She never really had a clear answer.
And this
to my
is why
knowledge of it.
having one party at all levels is a bad idea.
It sometimes works.
Does it? Yeah. When was the last time the New Democrats became government in Ottawa?
They have a good record at provincial levels of not running deficits. But Duncan doesn't cite these disagreements in her retirement announcement. She talks about being in Parliament for 10 years, which is honestly a legitimate reason to retire. So I'm really just speculating that the awkwardness between those two positions is a subtext here. She had a successful career as an environmental lawyer before entering politics, so it might just be that she wants a retirement. Maybe it's just coincidental that she's stuck in this really hard place. It opens up a nomination battle for a possible NDP hold. The NDP did build from that 500 vote win to a solid seat, but holding that in the next election, given how the federal NDP and provincial one are at such odds, it'll be a tough battle in Edmonton Strathcona in the next year. And Jagmeet Singh needs every seat he can get at this point,
including his own.
I think he's got a pretty safe bet in Burnaby South relative to some of his other choices out there.
So someone else who announced they will not be seeking re-election is the mayor of Nanaimo, which listeners may remember has had its fair share of turmoil at the municipal level.
It was his city manager, I believe, who threatened to shoot him in the head while she was leaving town or whatever. This is Bill McKay. Nanaimo's not had a great run of politics over the last 5 or so years, as Jesse Woodward told us. And it was going to be a contested election already. Leonard Krogh, the current NDP MLA for the riding, had announced he was going to run for mayor, and if he won, he would resign as MLA. Now it seems like a much easier path if you're not running against an incumbent, and you're a fairly popular, respected, not corrupt politician, as far as I know.
Yeah, and from the sounds of it, Nanaimo could use some fresh air, so probably a good thing to kind of change what has not been a great culture at the Nanaimo City Hall.
And so if Krogh does win in Nanaimo, that opens up this by-election, which could, in a distant chance, upset the balance of power in favor of the BC Liberals. But I did go through the Nanaimo and the Islands constituency results, and since 1963, the NDP has won all but 2 elections. In 1969, it went to Social Credit. I don't think the NDP did well that year. I think they got in the low 30s overall, province-wide. And in 2001, when they only won 2 seats, they did not win that seat. In the last election, they won by a hearty 14% popular vote. It'll be tough for anyone to beat the NDP in this, because it's just an orange riding. So kind of like how we had all those stupid debates about speakers last summer, we're now going to have a lot of stupid debates about this by-election whenever it happens that are inconsequential.
Yeah, I imagine it'll happen pretty quick. They'll probably call it almost immediately, since it is a fairly safe NDP seat. No point in leaving it vacant for very long. little over 30 days after October 20th is probably when Nanaimo will have a new MLA.
Before Christmas. Micah, before we close out, maybe just remind people where they can find you if they are a intrepid Sasquatch hunter and need counsel.
This is shocking. This is the first time I've ever been asked this question on this podcast. You can find me on Twitter at Micah Goldberg. The best way to reach me, you can tweet at me, or I think you can send me a direct message, however you want to do it. Otherwise, you can probably get in touch with me through either of these two gentlemen. They have my contact information.
And that has been Politicos. Find links to stories we mentioned in the show notes at politicos.ca. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. Support the show and get early access to our interviews at patreon.com/politicos. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.